Hello and welcome to Catholic Focus. I'm Sheridan Sanders. Joining us by Skype today is Professor Daniela Jupin-Jerome from the Loyola Institute for Ministry based out of New Orleans. And she's here to talk to us about the impact of social communications with insights from her book, Connected Toward Communion, The Church and Social Communication in the Digital Age. Well, thank you very much, Professor Daniela, for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sheridan and Salt and Light, for your hospitality for this conversation. I'm delighted to be here, looking forward to talking about the book and the research and just this great tradition we have in the Catholic Church on social communication.
So how did this book come about?
Well, this is an idea that really had its genesis when I was in graduate school. So I always like to make the joke that those who are in graduate school now, some of my students, in fact, when they're just trudging through papers, maybe they could be a book one day, so be encouraged. I was always taught by one of my mentors, Dr. Jane Regan, that church documents are not only very important, but they're our friends, really. She called documents our friends. And I feel like it's an undiscovered treasure in some ways, ecclesial documents. So as I researched social communication, as I researched catechesis and new media, which is my broader area of research, I found that for the American audience, there wasn't a widely available resource for pastoral audiences on a book that looks at the social communication documents of the church. And just my passion, looking at these solid pieces of work called the documents of the Catholic Church on social communication that are so insightful and so attuned and balanced and aware. So I just want to share this with people who care about this, and especially with people who are in pastoral work and maybe are overwhelmed or not sure how to proceed with proclaiming God's good news in the digital culture, in the digital age.
I was very intrigued by your title, which is Connected Towards Communion. What's the significance of that?
I was very intentional about this title, and the phrase is not my own invention. It's a paraphrase pulled out of one of the key social communication documents, Communio et Progressio, which was from 1971. And that document kind of lays out a beautiful theology of communication for these documents to think about. And it describes that the fact that we're connected through whatever communication media available to us doesn't just stand on its own, but it ought to always lead into something more toward relationships, toward a sense of community, and ultimately toward communion with one another, with God. So connected toward communion is a pithy phrase that tries to capture that beautiful theological concept that really is calling us home when we're thinking about communication and practicing communication through the increasingly changing media available to us in digital culture.
Can you paint for our viewers where we find ourselves now post the arrival of the internet? How has communication changed?
Well, it continues to change by the minute, it seems, so it's hard to really pin it down. And of course, the World Wide Web, we've just commemorated it being around for 25 years. So we're calling it new media, but it's not so new anymore. Some things that are significant about shifts that are occurring, one of them being participation of voices, participatory culture. This is a concept really made famous by Henry Jenkins, but I think it is so broadly applied now. So participatory culture means it's a shift away from broadcast culture, like the one-to-many communication style that still exists in some ways, of course. But participatory culture is more so recognizing the fact that everyone's got a voice. Everyone's got access to a gadget and access to internet connection can have a voice and exercise that voice in a way that they perceive it being meaningful for them. They perceive it being meaningful in a sense that they think it matters, not just for themselves, but for others. So that voice doesn't just speak out there to cyberspace, but it interacts in some fashion. And people are drawn to this, and it creates a sense of participation and belonging. So that's a reality, and what do we do with that many-fold communication, and how does that change the way that we think about gaining and sharing and creating and passing on knowledge, where knowledge comes from, where authoritative knowledge comes from, where does truth come from? And these kinds of questions are all shifting because so many people have a voice and access to a voice. So that could have its challenges, of course, but also its benefits. And so to think through that and how to leverage that in a way that's constructive and edifying for the community is one challenge. Also, with the proliferation of voices comes the challenge of kind of authority and who's in charge. Which voice is more important than the other? And how does a voice stand out? I think there's a lot to say on that. One thing I would highlight, especially for people in ecclesial or church or pastoral context working in ministry, is I think nowadays, because there are so many voices present, it's not so much being online anymore, whether a parish or a ministry should go online and then that kind of gets everything ready to go. But that's not the question anymore. The question is, how does one's voice stand out and garner interaction and garner dialogue from others in the digital culture? Because there are so many voices can so easily get lost. So the challenge now is not just to have a voice, but how's that voice heard, and how does that voice invite dialogue? How does that voice invite encounter? If we want to kind of skip ahead and think about Pope Francis' take on all of this. So that's a challenge I really perceive, but also, again, an opportunity. And the third one I'd like to speak of is because of this idea of authority being so fluid and so many voices having a go at something to say, there has been a proliferation, in my perception, about violent language, violent words, because there isn't really a sense of checking on that or being held accountable for that. Now, of course, there are ways of checking and being held accountable, but it's not the same as being face-to-face in some ways with digital culture. So we do see a lot of comment boards, a lot of reviews, just a lot of interaction that is cutting and violent and a bit more harsh than it would be if it were face-to-face. And of course, the extremes of this are cyberbullying and harassment and these kinds of things. So again, there's an opportunity and a challenge. Like, what do we do with that reality that since we're behind screens, we're able to be less inhibited? But how do we still keep it civil? How do we intend to communicate, in fact, toward communion if the screens don't compel us to be civil with one another as readily as face-to-face would be? So these are three things I would name, but there are so many more we could explore, and there's always new ones coming up. These three stand out for me, though, at the moment.
Okay, so let's jump back, let's say, to the degree on social communications, and then, of course, it's almost sister document you suggest in your book, Communio and Progressio. So tell me about the relationship between the two documents and some distinctive features of each.
It was really delightful for me to research the documents, and one of the most exciting one I looked at was Inter Mirifica, which is the Second Vatican Council's document on mass media or social communication. And this was within the first session. This document was worked on, and we have the record of the Council Fathers standing up and offering their opinions on this. And it's delightful to read because it's so inspired, but also so human. And it's almost like a meeting any parish council or ministry would have nowadays, where some people think this and some people think this. That's what the Council Fathers did at St. Peter's Basilica. So that was kind of awesome. But some of the main strokes are, for me, it's a brief document. In fact, it's not a very long one, not a very detailed one, and it received some critique for this, but it also received some praise for this. So it was a complex document. So in and of its own, it's not very thorough in that sense. But I think its major contribution is really putting this topic itself on the agenda of an ecumenical council, which is kind of amazing.
Yeah.
And it was the discussion preceding it had to do with liturgy and revelation, and following it, the Council Fathers talked about the church. Lumen Gentium came out of that eventually, Christian unity. So these heavy hitter topics, and amongst these, we find kind of wedged in there this decree on the mass media, and in fact, it's a conciliar joke that there's such a thing. It's a conciliar joke that they, on purpose, put this document on the docket, on the agenda, after liturgy and revelation and before Christian unity and the church, to have an opportunity quote for relaxation, because it had to do with mass media and entertainment. So that was their council joke. But it was definitely considered a lighter topic. So some Council Fathers even wondered if it's a worthwhile topic enough, since it's not strictly a theological one, but it's pastoral, cultural, and more so in that sense. So there was even debate on what is this? Are we spending good time on good resources on this? Or should we be using our time on this? But they did, and I think that's a really significant contribution, recognizing both the cultural influence of, at that time, mass communication, and the implications it might have for thinking theologically about communication, about relationship, about community, about being present to one another, and also in some more practical ways, it generated some other things that gave way for the church to continue to think about this. One of them was the annual Day of the World Communications Day, which has a message each year coupled with it. So we've had that since 1967 because of this document deciding that that should be a good idea. So that's beautiful. I love that that was decided. It also established the Pontifical Council for Social Communication, which does primarily, it does a lot of practical things in terms of the church's work and thinking about communication, offering workshops and training sessions, hosting conferences, and these kinds of things. So establishing a part of the Roman Curia that thinks about this, also really valuable. And then finally, its last practical outcome was generating this document, Communia Progressio, which was written, it was published by 1971, but calling for that to be created because they recognized, we got this topic on the agenda here at Vatican II. It's going to be a brief discussion here, but it's evident to us that there's more to say and that conversation should continue about this. So they commissioned this document to be created and flesh this topic out. And so from this we inherit Communia Progressio that came out a couple of years later. And some even say that it's almost the last document of Vatican II because it so builds on the spirit of course, it wasn't strictly at the council it was created, but definitely out of the spirit of it.
Very interesting. And what do you think the big takeaway is from Communio and Progressio?
Again, it's this idea of, there's so many, but I'll try to limit myself. It's this idea of the theology of communication and how is that central to how we understand not just how media works and our engagement with it, but really like who God is and who we're called to be as a people and what our call is as people of faith to be communicators of the good news in the most fundamental way. What is communication? I mean, real practically, it's saying and hearing and like what we're doing right now through the gift of Skype. But really, it outlines things like offering the metaphor of Christ as the perfect communicator. So what does that mean to think about Christ as the perfect communicator? And that implies to both his very essence, his being, which is an intimate relationship between the human and divine. That's communication. His divine being is an act of communication between human and divine. And of course, the ways he actually communicated, that he told parables, that he preached and so forth. What can we learn from that?
Right.
And then highlighting from that that metaphor also is this idea of communication being a beautiful sense of a gift of self in love.
Well, all very interesting, Professor Daniela. We'll be right back after the break.
Popes have always been defined, at least in part, by what they write. Encyclicals, homilies, constitutions, exhortations, and letters are the staples of papal communication. But times are changing. On December 12, 2012, Pope Benedict XVI tweeted for the first time. 140 characters isn't a lot to get your message out, but both he and now Pope Francis have stuck with it, and people are responding. The Pope is now the most influential world leader on Twitter, getting about 3 times more retweets than the next closest leader. That means people are reading and sharing the Pope's messages religiously, no pun intended, which in the world of social media is absolutely essential for staying relevant. It also shows us that even for a 2,000-year-old institution, things can still change with the push of a button.
And that was a clip from an episode on media from the Salt and Light series, The Church Alive, a show totally dedicated to the new evangelization. Professor Daniela, so now that we find ourselves in the internet age, what types of challenges does this pose in terms of formation?
Oh, that's such a good question. I'm so glad that you asked me that. I think the first and most basic challenge is a sense of sort of overwhelm because it's such a fluid reality, digital culture, and it's always changing, and there's just so much coming at us, so much information, so many voices. Just as an aside, I love it that we're right now during the season of Lent, and that there are so many resources available that are coming down through my Twitter feed and social media page. But I wonder also about the spirit of Lent and introspection and reflection, if there's just so much coming at us every day, like, is this really in the spirit of it? Although I think that's great that all things are available. So it's just an indication of how much information there is out there, and that could really overwhelm people, and they kind of even recoil from it and resist exploring this constructively as a space where we can really authentically encounter others and invite them toward relationship and community. So that's the basic stumbling block, is that there's just so much, and where do people begin? In terms of formation, there's also a sense, especially in priestly formation, of kind of the seminary is a kind of place where seeds grow, where seeds are nurtured. So it's a protected place, and it's kind of a boundaried place in some sense for that seed to be able to flourish. And so this culture doesn't automatically connect well with that because it's diffusive and it doesn't really have boundaries. And so I think seminaries are doing interesting and creative things, trying to think about how to recognize the culturality of the digital age as part of priestly formation. And certainly for the priest, especially, his ministry of assessing the bishop as a priest, prophet, and king in governing, sanctifying, and teaching, in other words. Digital culture gets at those roles in real particular ways from all of those angles. And so for our priests to be prepared to think about what does it mean to govern in digital culture in that capacity? What does that mean to have, social media guidelines that are solid for the parish or for the diocese? What does it mean to teach? Well, teaching would imply, helping the faithful communicate authentically in the voices that they will exercise through social media. It's not just one communicator anymore. Many are communicating. So how do we help people as ministers to be authentic communicators themselves instead of doing the communication for them? And then, of course, sanctifying, it's this idea of recognizing where communication today needs wholeness, needs healing, needs saving in some sense, where it's gone awry, when it's become violent, when it's become cutting. And so how do we bring a Christian faith-based voice to that sanctifies that context and fills it in with a good word, with the good news? And our ministers, priests and lay ministers alike, have a real leading role in that, have a real prophetic role in that to play, to demonstrate how to take an active role in bringing the good word online as opposed to the word that cuts or breaks or tears down. So ministerial formation, I detailed some in terms of priestly formation, but of course lay ministerial formation also, builds on the baptismal identity of priest, prophet, and king in different ways. And those are areas that a layperson or a person toward ordination can engage in likewise. So these are things to think about and kind of gateways into thinking about this medium, this culture strategically when it comes to thinking about serving people as church more intentionally.
Right. And then, we've got a wonderful pontiff who is just so good at understanding, it seems, social communications today. I mean, we've got a pope who does selfies and is just so connected. I mean, I think millions are following him on Twitter. What do you think Pope Francis brings to this whole discussion?
Oh, a couple of things. And as part of writing this book, I've had the amazing privilege to travel to the Vatican and learn and observe how the Vatican thinks about social communication nowadays. Especially, I am grateful to the Pontifical Council for Social Communication for hosting me for a couple of days and allowing me to see inside that world. And I take away so many amazing lessons from that. One of them is about this whole ministry of digital communication that Pope Francis he's the culmination of that. Well, first of all, I think he has a spirit of freedom. I think that's part of his Jesuit formation and identity. Working at a Jesuit institution, I make the connection.
Of course.
that I think he has a sense to discern where the Spirit is moving creatively and constructive in the world and to be open to that. And I think maybe he has recognized or he's followed good counsel on looking at this culture that is through and through digital and becoming even more so, and discerning opportunities for the Spirit within that are perhaps different than ways that were done before in the past. So just an openness to that and exploring that, doing an iPhone video message to a gathering of American Protestants or a Google Hangout, these kinds of things, popes have never done before, but why not try if it could be done well and in a good spirit? So I see that as a good example. I also respect him for his team-based approach, and I think that's a huge lesson for ministers, people of pastoral ministry, thinking about social communication, thinking about digital culture. Something I learned at the Vatican is that this is entirely a team effort. I mean, even his Twitter account is a team effort that he's he's intimately involved in, but people help him with that, so that he has people assisting, people with gifts in certain areas assisting, making this happen, obviously. And so when it comes down to the parish level, when it comes down to a particular ministry level, one hindrance becomes for people, well, I gotta do all this plus everything else I do, and I can't keep up. Why not think about a team-based approach likewise, and why not distribute tasks and come together collaboratively around social media presence? I think seems to be the way to go, and it's I think something he's monitoring really well. And the third lesson from him that I really appreciate, and also it's an appreciation that I would say about Pope Benedict and John Paul II and ones before him, is the World Communications Day messages, which are these pithy messages, these short messages each year that kind of get at one topic of communication or another. And both the Pope Francis ones have been just so beautiful and full of rich metaphors that one can kind of ruminate on. And this year, the message is deeply imbued with the theme of family, and it's so beautiful, Sheridan. It talks about the encounter between Elizabeth and Mary, the visitation, of course, as kind of a rich metaphor for communication, and talks about the womb as the first place where we experience communication. And I sit with it, and I'm deeply moved. So he doesn't just talk about gadgets and platforms, but he talks about deeply human realities and deeply scriptural, gospel-based realities, speaking to this context in a way people can understand. And I think that's exactly the kind of pastoral teaching that needs to be done, bringing together the beautiful wisdom of the past in ways that speak to the reality today, in simple terms, in terms we can take away.
Right. And for people who read your book, what are some of your hopes for them?
My hope, first of all, is a sense to kind of exhale, especially those who are in ministry. They kind of exhale and say, okay, I could do this, or we could do this. Because I do sense there's a sense of overwhelm.
Right.
Something I hope, in addition, that people who read the book take away from it, especially those who are in pastoral ministry or similar kinds of ministries, is that the idea of the church grappling with the reality of communication and media is not a new reality. It's not a new question. The culture we're experiencing is new, but the fact that we're thinking about communication as a church has been something that's been around since the Holy Spirit came and blew through that upper room on Pentecost morning, and the people were given the ability to speak and spoke in all those languages. Like, the church is born, in a sense, out of an act of communication. So as a church, communication is really central to who we are. We've done this for a long time. And also the idea of media. Of course, the church has relied on media forever for communication, whether we're thinking about stained glass windows or illuminated manuscripts, or someone like Archbishop Fulton Sheen. We've done media, and we've done communication. We are communication in a lot of ways. And so this is just another way of experiencing that challenge and opportunity, and for people to kind of recognize that. And I think the documents that have been around since the 60s, at least, the ones I highlight, kind of lead us into the recognition of this is a lot older and broader than contemporary digital culture that we're finding ourselves floating away in sometimes. We have a foothold, it's tradition, and let's look back, and then with that, let's look forward, and we'll find a way. We're spirit-led, we hope, and we shall try to strive forward with evangelization, with the good news, the best we can with the help of the Spirit, even if media change and platforms change. So I do hope for that takeaway.
Well, thank you very much. It was wonderful speaking to you about this very hopeful opportunity that all of us are invited to participate in.
Sheridan, I so appreciate your time, and thank you so much for this opportunity to engage and talk about this.
Thank you. I was speaking with Professor Daniela Jupin-Jerome from the Loyola Institute for Ministry based out of New Orleans about the impact of social communication with insights from her book, Connected Toward Communion, the Church and Social Communication in the Digital Age, published by Liturgical Press. And that's all for tonight. If you have any comments or questions about this episode of Focus, write to us, focus@saltandlighttv.org. For Catholic Focus, I'm Sheridan Sanders. Thanks for watching.